There are days when the house seems bigger than it actually is. You walk through the same rooms as always, the kitchen where the coffee cools slowly, the hallway that knows your footsteps, the window that has seen so many sunrises, but everything seems to echo differently. It's as if the silence has weight. The clock doesn't just mark the hours, it underlines the absence. And in moments like these, it's impossible not to wonder, does anyone still think about me? Does anyone miss my presence? There's no shame in admitting this question. Loneliness, when it lingers, begins to speak to us. It speaks in the details. In the table set for just one person, in the sofa that's too big, in the memories that reside in the picture frames. It remembers those who left, those who moved on with their lives, those who promised to come back later and never did. And little by little, if the pain finds no answer, the cruel feeling of invisibility arises, the kind that hurts without screaming, the kind that corrodes slowly. But before you accept the lie that nobody notices you, I want to invite you to look at this situation from another angle. Silence doesn't always mean absence. Lack of movement doesn't always mean abandonment. There's a profound difference between being alone in the eyes of others and being forgotten in the eyes of God. And this difference appears on every page of the Bible, even in the stories we think we already know. The psalmist declared, "You know when I rise and when I lie down. You discern my way." Psalm 139. This includes the mornings when you wake up without witnesses and the nights when you turn off the light without a good night. It includes the moment you sigh before getting up from your chair, the instant you hold your glass with both hands because it's cold, and even that little pang of sadness that appears when the doorbell rings and it's not who you expected. God sees all of this, not as an inspector but as someone who truly cares. Perhaps you feel your life has passed unnoticed these past few years. Perhaps no one knows about the nights you cried softly in the kitchen so as not to wake anyone. Perhaps no one saw how your eyes welled up when you found that photograph you hadn't looked at in ages. Perhaps no one noticed how you hid the pain when you said, "I'm fine," even when you weren't. But God saw. And He didn't just see, He remained. It's hard to believe when the phone doesn't ring, when dates pass by unnoticed, when conversations are shorter than before. Human loneliness hurts because we were created to coexist. Physical absence weighs heavily because touch, voice, familiar faces are part of our emotional structure. But there is a presence that doesn't depend on distance, time, age, or human company. A presence that isn't offended when you're tired, that doesn't get impatient when you take a long time to talk, that doesn't distance itself when you feel weak. That is why the psalmist also said, "Though my father and mother forsake me, the Lord will receive me." Psalm 27:10. This phrase would not be necessary if God ignored human suffering. It exists because He knows that human bonds can break, that families can disperse, that friends can drift apart. It exists because the Bible does not fantasize about life. It acknowledges that abandonment happens, and precisely for this reason, God promises not to act as others act. You may think your house has become too small for your dreams and too big for your loneliness, but it has never been too big for God. What you call an empty house, He calls a meeting place. What you call heavy silence, He calls fertile ground, to speak to you in a way that may never have been possible before, in years of rushing around, commitments and responsibilities. You may not realize it, but there is a huge difference between abandonment and silent attention. Abandonment is neglect. Silent attention is care. It's what a mother does when she watches her child sleep, without touching, without waking, but completely present. It's what a father does when he discreetly watches the gate waiting for his child to return. It's what God does like no one else knows how. He observes, He accompanies, He is near. In silence, He sits beside you, as if to say, "I am still here." And here's something you may never have thought about. God pays attention precisely to those whom the world ignores. He chooses those who are in the background, not because they are strong, but because they are sincere. He approaches those who cry in silence, because He knows the value of tears that no one else has seen. He hears words that you sometimes murmur while tidying the kitchen, while folding clothes, while looking out the window, searching for a familiar face that doesn't appear. So before you accept that your life is small, that your days have lost their relevance, or that your presence makes no difference, take a deep breath. The God who accompanied you in your youth has not abandoned you in old age. The God who heard your first prayers still hears every word you whisper before falling asleep. The God who gave you the strength to raise a family, face crises, survive losses, and get up so many times, is still here. He continues to see you, closely, attentively, with love. The silence that surrounds you doesn't define your story. Sometimes it's just the backdrop for something God is about to show you, because even if the house is quiet, heaven is watching. Even if no one knocks on your door today, God has never stopped knocking on your heart. And even if you live alone, you are not living forgotten. I'll stop here. There's a kind of silence that's more unsettling than any noise. It's not the silence of the early morning, nor the silence of the streets on a cloudy day. It's the silence within the mind, the kind that starts softly, and before you know it, has become a constant whisper, almost a parallel narration of your life. It appears when you're sitting in the living room staring at a switched-off TV. It emerges when you lie in bed and the darkness seems greater than usual. It creeps in when you do small tasks, washing a cup, folding a cloth, closing the door, and realize that no one saw you do any of it. The problem isn't being alone. The problem is what loneliness starts to say when no one is looking. Little by little it becomes a voice. Sometimes more than one. One says, "You're no longer missed." Another adds, "If you disappeared, the world would remain the same." A third, more cruel, whispers, "If no one cares, it's because you don't matter anymore." And it's amazing how quickly the human heart believes stories that hurt. It doesn't matter if rationally you know you've lived a lot, that you've done a lot, that you've given love, time, effort, care. It doesn't matter if you know you're loved by someone, even if they're far away. When daily life repeats itself without witnesses, when the hours all seem the same, pain creates a narrative, and this narrative becomes a kind of lens, a very dark lens through which you begin to see everything. Suddenly, any silence becomes proof of abandonment. Any delay becomes confirmation that you don't matter. The mind, when wounded, works like this. It takes a small fact and builds a gigantic conclusion. For example, a child doesn't call. The mind says, "Then I'm a burden." A neighbor waves hurriedly without stopping to talk. The mind says, "Nobody wants my company." The body aches and nobody notices. The mind says, "I'm growing old alone and nobody cares." These conclusions seem logical because pain lends them coherence. But coherence doesn't mean truth. There are many things that seem to make sense on a dark day, but fall apart when placed in the light. The Bible illustrates this powerfully in the story of Elijah. He had just faced one of the greatest spiritual battles of his life. He had witnessed God act powerfully, but when he felt threatened and weary, he fled. He ran as if trying to escape his own mind. He sat under a tree and asked to die. The phrase he uttered sums up what emotional loneliness does to us. "I am no better than my ancestors." It was as if Elijah were saying, "Nothing I did was worthwhile. Nothing I lived through matters." Then he hid in a cave. And there, inside that hole in the rock, he repeated to himself a distorted version of reality. "I am the only one left. I am the only one who still serves you." This phrase, uttered twice by him, was not true. But in Elijah's mind, it seemed perfectly logical. He was tired, isolated, afraid. And pain creates stories so convincing that even a prophet believed them. God didn't yell at Elijah. He didn't accuse him. He didn't say, "Stop talking nonsense." God did something much deeper. He entered the narrative Elijah had created and began to dismantle it. First carefully, then firmly. God didn't speak to Elijah in the strong wind, nor in the earthquake, nor in the fire. He spoke in a whisper, because Elijah's mind was too noisy to hear anything else. The lesson is simple and powerful. When inner voices begin to shout, God speaks more softly, but closer. Perhaps you identify strongly with Elijah in the cave. You may not have run away from anyone, but you have distanced yourself emotionally because you grew tired of waiting for a response from someone who never shows up. Perhaps you feel like the last one in your family, or the last one among your friends. Perhaps loneliness has built within you a narrative that seems true. My story is over. My usefulness is over. My presence is dispensable. But listen very carefully. None of this is true. These are conclusions that spring from pain, not from reality. Truth does not arise from human abandonment. It arises from what God says about you. And what does he say? He says that you are seen, that you are remembered, that your life was not wasted, that your story is not over, and that, although you live alone, you are not lonely. The human mind, without companionship, without conversation, without the exchange of affection, creates shortcuts to explain its suffering. But God never asked you to accept these explanations as definitive truths. He did not create your mind to bear such harsh conclusions alone. He does not want you to struggle with thoughts that were fabricated by weariness. Perhaps you've already noticed something curious. The more time we spend alone, the more we talk to ourselves. And this internal dialogue can be kind or cruel. It can lift you up or tear you down. It can bring peace or it can torture you. That's why taking care of your mind is just as essential as taking care of your body. And here's the part that almost no one tells elderly people who live alone. The mind also ages. And when it ages, it loses its filters. It becomes more sensitive to abandonment, more vulnerable to fear, more open to thoughts that seem like absolute truths simply because they are repeated frequently. That's why God insists in the Bible on renewing the mind, filling the heart with truth, and replacing destructive thoughts with promises. Not because it's nice, but because it's necessary. The most dangerous enemy of loneliness is not the lack of people, it's the story you come to believe about yourself. And if you want to start transforming this story, here's the first step. Identify the phrases that form within you when you're alone. Ask yourself, is this fact or interpretation? Did this come from pain or from God? Does this conclusion bring me closer to life or push me into darkness? Sometimes, simply changing one sentence can change the whole day. Just replace "nobody cares" with "God cares." Replace "I'm alone" with "I'm accompanied in presence, even if not in company." Replace "my life is over" with "my life is in a silent chapter, but still in progress." The internal narrative you allow to remain within you will determine how you see everything outside. That's why God doesn't give up speaking, even when you think there's no one left to listen. He speaks to the weary heart. He speaks to the restless mind. He speaks when you close the living room window and think your day has ended meaninglessly. He speaks because you still have value. He speaks because you are still important. He speaks because loneliness may try to write your story, but it doesn't have permission to be the final chapter. There is a silent beauty that only those who have lived a long time know. It is not the beauty of youth, which shines on the outside. It is the beauty of the soul that carries scars, memories, losses, victories, and stories that only time is capable of building. That is why God never treated old age as an end. He treated it as a repository. A repository of wisdom, of memory, of refined faith. And it is precisely when the world looks at the elderly as people at the end of their journey that God looks at them as people who already see more than others. The Bible says something profoundly revealing in Joel 2:28. Your old men will dream dreams. It doesn't say they will remember old dreams. It says they will dream. To dream, a verb of the future, a verb of purpose, a verb of someone who still has something to give. This verse alone destroys the idea that spiritual old age means pause or irrelevance. In the eyes of heaven, accumulated years do not diminish a human being. They intensify them. The truth is, after a lifetime, your soul becomes a library. Each shelf holds an episode. The love you experienced, the children you raised, the mistakes you made, the victories you thought you'd never achieve, the miracles that happened when you least expected them. And precisely because of this, you become someone who sees what younger people don't yet have the maturity to see. Youth has energy, old age, perspective. And perspective is a rare gift. Think of Naomi. She lost everything: her husband, her children, her stability, her future. She returned to her homeland carrying her grief like someone carrying a suitcase too heavy to bear. She herself said, "Do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has made my life bitter." So this phrase sounds like defeat, like giving up. But God did not abandon Naomi in that emotional state. He saw something she could not yet see, that her story, even wounded, was about to become the foundation for a reconstruction. Naomi's old age was fertile ground for a miracle of redemption. That elderly woman, who thought all that remained for her was to await death, became a fundamental piece in the story of Ruth, and through that story, in the lineage of David, and, centuries later, in the lineage of Jesus. Do you see? An elderly woman, sitting in a corner of the city, weeping over her losses, was still part of an eternal plan. The loneliness she felt did not erase her value. It only made even more evident how much God could act right there. Now consider Daniel. When we imagine Daniel, We think of the young man thrown into the lion's den, but the magnificent visions he had, those that revealed the future of entire nations, did not come in his youth. They came when he was already old, exiled, weary, living in a foreign land for decades. There was no party, no audience, no celebration. He was alone, and it was precisely in this solitude that God opened the heavens and showed him things that no one else was ready to receive. These examples illustrate something profound. God keeps mature revelations for mature people, not because young people have no value, but because certain truths can only be delivered to those who have already experienced life, who have already been broken and rebuilt, who have already learned that faith is not emotion, it is rooted. Only those who have lived long years know what it means to trust God when logic says no. Only those who have gone through difficult times know how to recognize God's voice even when the mind is weary. That is why many elderly people become something that the modern world does not recognize, but heaven deeply values. Sentinels of the dawn. Sentinels are those who watch when everyone sleeps, those who stay awake when no one else can, those who observe the horizon and perceive signs before others. How many nights have you spent awake, talking to God, thinking about life, praying for children, grandchildren, neighbors, friends? How many times have you knelt in the early morning, asking for protection for those who don't even know they are being protected? How many tears have fallen on the pillow like invisible seeds that only God saw? That is the role of a sentinel. And it doesn't matter that no one has praised, acknowledged, thanked, or noticed. Heaven saw. Heaven recorded. Heaven valued. And there are eternal rewards reserved for those who remain faithful even when alone. In the Bible there is a very clear pattern. The quieter the phase, the deeper the mission. It was the same with Naomi. It was the same with Daniel. It was the same with Anna, the elderly widow who recognized the Messiah in the temple. It was the same with John on Patmos, alone on an island, receiving the vision of the apocalypse. What do they all have in common? They all lived long periods without an audience, without applause, without witnesses, and it was precisely during these periods that God used them most powerfully. And that says something about you. Your solitude doesn't mean your story is over. It may mean you've entered the most spiritual season of your life. When you were young, perhaps God had to divide his attention between work, family, responsibilities, and the rush of daily life. Not anymore. Now there's enough silence for him to speak more deeply. Now there's enough time for you to hear more clearly. Now there's enough space for him to build something within you that no one else notices. But that has eternal value. You carry something that younger generations don't have: memory. And memory isn't the past, it's direction. Those who carry memory know where God has been faithful, where God has opened paths, where God has restored what seemed lost. And only those who have seen all of this can be a voice of wisdom for future generations. Perhaps you feel stuck, that your life is slow and repetitive, but spiritually, the opposite may be happening. You may be experiencing the period of greatest invisible influence in your life. Your advice, given at the right moment, can change someone's destiny. Your prayer, offered in the silence of the early morning, can protect someone who will never know how much you interceded. Your words can heal wounds that no one else notices. You are memory guardian. You are sentinel of the dawn. You are someone God has chosen to stand firm while others falter. And if the world doesn't realize it, it doesn't matter. Heaven does. Old age, in God's eyes, is not fading away. It is authority. Loneliness, in God's eyes, is not abandonment. It is intimacy. Silent nights, in God's eyes, are not wasted. They are spiritual shifts. God doesn't see you as someone at the end. He sees you as someone who has finally reached the right point of maturity to understand what was previously incomprehensible, to receive what was previously incomprehensible, to dream what was previously incomprehensible. You are not isolated from purpose. You are surrounded by it. Just open your heart and realize, this silent chapter may be the most profound in your story. There is a painful contrast that is rarely discussed, but which needs to be faced honestly. The distance between what people say they believe and what they actually practice. Faith, in words, always seems beautiful, full of promises, verses, declarations of love for one's neighbor. But faith in practice is revealed precisely in caring for those whom the world insists on leaving behind: the elderly, the lonely, those who no longer produce as before, those who have lost their physical strength, but carry a soul full of stories. It's easy to love while there's something in return. It's difficult to love when the other person can no longer offer anything visible in exchange, and it is precisely there that God tests the sincerity of the human heart. The Bible is not shy about this. On the contrary, it prioritizes the elderly, widows, the weak, and the forgotten in the kingdom. In Proverbs, God commands that those with gray hair be honored. In Leviticus, he requires that a person stand in the presence of the elderly as a gesture of reverence. In James, he says that true religion necessarily includes caring for the most vulnerable. And in all these passages, the pattern is the same. Faith is a lie when it ignores old age. But the modern world operates at the pace of utility. If you produce, if you generate profit, if you are busy, if you are active, you have value. If you age, if your body weakens, if your abilities diminish, you become invisible. That is why so many elderly people live in silent homes, not by choice, but because the fast-paced lives of others leave no room for visiting, listening, welcoming, sitting, lingering. And the most tragic thing is that this doesn't only happen to people distant from faith, it happens within families themselves and within churches themselves. You may have already experienced this firsthand. Perhaps you've seen children or grandchildren go weeks without asking how you are. Perhaps you've noticed that when they ask for your opinion, it's more out of politeness than genuine interest. Perhaps you've observed that during family meals, you're sometimes nothing more than a humble ornament on the table, someone who's there but doesn't truly participate. And perhaps you've closed the door after a visit that was too short, with that tightness in your chest that only an adult soul knows, the realization that time has taught young people to rush, but not to care. It's painful to admit this, but it's necessary, because God recognizes it before you do. He saw when you dedicated years to the same people who now barely have time to show up. He saw the nights you stayed up caring for those who today don't remember to thank you. He saw the sacrifices you made when you were still strong. He saw the full house that has now become quiet. And that is why he personally bears the burden of neglect in family and community. In Leviticus 19, he says, "Honor the face of the aged and fear your God." In other words, the way someone treats an elderly person reveals how much that person truly fears God. If children do not honor God, God sees it. If the church doesn't visit, God sees. If the neighbors don't notice your absence, God does. If people only remember you when they need something, God sees. And each of these behaviors carries consequences, not for you, but for them. Neglecting the elderly is not just a character flaw, it is spiritual disobedience. It is breaking a commandment as serious as stealing, lying, or hurting, because abandoning those who once cared for you is to wound the heart of God. But here's where something important needs to be said. Your worth doesn't diminish when others fail to recognize it. Your dignity is not measured by the frequency of visits. Your purpose does not disappear when doors don't open. Your importance doesn't diminish because someone forgot to call. Your life doesn't lose meaning because the world has become rushed. If the carelessness of others defines anything, it's not who you are. It's who they've become. This truth needs to enter your heart like a balm, because many elderly people carry guilt they shouldn't. Did I do something wrong? Was I a bad father? Was I not good enough as a mother, grandmother, friend? Was I too burdensome? Does my presence bother people? But this guilt isn't yours. It's a product of the world's fast pace, not your own history. The Bible does not say, old age is a sign of uselessness. He says, old age is a sign of honor. It doesn't say, the elderly should be forgotten. It says, stand up before them. It doesn't say, old age is a burden for young people. It says, it is a source of wisdom for all generations. If there's anyone who should be ashamed, it's not you. It's those who have stopped practicing what they claim to believe. At the same time, the Word also teaches something fundamental. Family is not just about blood ties. God rebuilds families in surprising ways. He creates bonds between neighbors, between people in the community, between brothers and sisters in faith, between different generations. He can bring new, unexpected people around you who see in you the value that others have failed to see. People who don't share your last name, but carry your respect. People who may not have your story, but cherish it. God knows that keeping an elderly person alone in complete abandonment is contrary to his character, and he acts to break that cycle. Sometimes he sends company discreetly. A young man walks by and asks if you're okay. A neighbor who offers help without asking for anything in return. Someone from the church who insists on knowing how you really are. An unexpected person who shows up with food, medicine, a favor, or a gesture. Never underestimate these small interventions. They are not coincidences. They are tools of heaven. And if you feel left out, humiliated, forgotten, it's important to remember, you are not reaping the consequences of your own worth, but of the haste of others. Your life remains precious. Your voice remains necessary. And your presence still has an impact even if it seems silent. But God is also calling you to something else. Not to allow bitterness to take over your heart. Resentment is a slow poison. It corrodes from the inside out. And if you let it in, it doesn't just harm you. It weakens the purpose God still has for your life. It's hard not to hold a grudge when others fail, but you weren't called to carry the weight of others' failures. What God asks of you is simple, yet profound. Protect your heart. Give your pain to Him. Trust that He sees what others do not see. Don't let the carelessness of others define who you are. Allow Him to rebuild bonds where previous ones have been broken. God will not let you grow old alone inside. The world may have forgotten who built the house, but God does not forget. He honors those who were faithful. He sees who planted, who cared, who loved. And He promises to restore all lost dignity, not only in heaven, but also in this life. There comes a time in life when everything seems to slow down. The streets get noisier, but the house becomes quieter. Conversations dwindle, visits become less frequent. The body doesn't respond as it once did, and the heart sometimes believes this means the end has come. But in God's eyes, old age is not closure. It is a harvest season. Not the quick, hurried harvest of early life, but the late harvest, the one that ripens slowly, that takes time, but brings forth fruits that are deeper, sweeter, and more full of purpose than any other. Society may view old age as a decline. God sees it as a peak. And you really need, to reclaim that divine perspective on yourself. The Bible says in Psalm 92:14, "In old age they will still bear fruit. They will be full of sap and vigorous." This statement is not poetic. It is not figurative. It is not symbolic in the weak sense of the word. It is spiritually literal. It affirms that there is a type of vitality that has nothing to do with muscles, physical energy, or productivity. It is spiritual vitality, the kind that only time can generate. It is not strength that manifests in the body. It is strength that manifests in the spirit. And perhaps you don't even realize it, but you carry this strength within you. It lies in your ability to see what others don't see, in your sensitivity to what truly matters, in your ease in distinguishing what is essential from what is mere noise, in the advice you give, which is imbued with decades of life experience, in the prayers you offer, which are born not from theories, but from experience. The younger ones run, but they don't see far. The older ones may walk slowly, but they see beyond. And God deeply values this expanded vision that only comes with time. When He looks at you, He doesn't see age. He sees history. He sees depth. He sees roots. He sees a faith that is not built in weeks, but in years. He sees a soul that has been shaped by laughter, pain, waiting, disappointments, new beginnings, storms, and silent miracles. That's why the late harvest is so powerful. It doesn't depend on what you can do physically. It depends on what you've become. And what have you become? Someone who has seen God act more than once. Someone who has fallen, gotten up, fallen again, and gotten up again. Someone who has lost and then recovered. Someone who has loved deeply and had their heart broken more than once. Someone who has endured long nights and still managed to wake up. Someone who has learned, over the years, that God has never failed. You think that's not much? Heaven doesn't think so. Perhaps you're thinking, but now it's too late for me to be used by God. And God answers, now you are ready. Youth has enthusiasm, but maturity has precision. Young people shoot in all directions. Older people know exactly where to aim. Consider Simeon and Anna, two elderly people almost invisible to society, but essential to God's plan. It was they, not the most influential priests, who recognized the Messiah in the temple. Why? Because the spiritual vision of those who walk with God for decades is sharper than that of those who live in the noise of life. Consider Moses. He only began his true mission at the age of 80. Think of Caleb. He asked for the most difficult mountain at age 85. Think of John. You received the revelation of the apocalypse as an old and isolated man. Old age didn't stop any of them, it positioned them. And may I tell you something with all due respect, affection and sincerity? You are in position. Yes, you, with their pains, with its history, with its losses, with your quiet home, with his faith that he endured, with her tears protected by God. During those nights when she spoke with him without witnesses, this was not a waste. This was preparation. Perhaps you feel useless because the modern world only sees usefulness in what is visibly produced. But God works with a completely different logic. What moves heaven is not productivity. It's depth. It's not rushing, it's remaining. It's not speaking loudly, it's listening attentively. It's not doing a lot, it's doing it right. And you're at a stage in life where you can do things right like never before. There are people only you can reach because only you have lived what you have lived. There are pains only you can understand because only you have gone through them. There are pieces of advice only you can give because only you possess the wisdom that time has bestowed upon you. There are prayers only you can offer with the intensity of someone who truly knows what it means to depend on God. And maybe you think you live alone. But spiritually, you are not isolated. You are in a watchtower. A watchtower is an elevated, silent, secluded place where the watchman sees before others. It seems like isolation, but it's a strategic position. The watchman is not forgotten. He is necessary. If he fails, the city is in danger. But if he remains vigilant, much is avoided, much is anticipated, much is protected. When God allows you to go through a period of silence, it's not to hide you, it's to position you. Of course you miss hugs, voices, companionship. God knows this. He doesn't demand that you enjoy human solitude. He doesn't say it's fussy. On the contrary, he validates your pain. He recognizes your longing. He knows that human touch is missed, but at the same time he whispers something important. Even without an audience, you still have a mission. Even alone, you still have a purpose. Even in silence, you still have an impact. Perhaps your mission now is not to run, but to intercede. It's not about teaching loudly, but about advising calmly. It's not about participating in everything, but about being present when someone needs to hear from a wise soul. It's not about making a lot of movements, but about making deep movements. The late harvest is like that. Silent, but transformative. And there's something even more surprising. The purpose God has for you now may be greater than anything you experienced in your youth, because now you know how to discern what is from God and what is deception. Now you know when a word heals and when a word hurts. Now you know that miracles are not theatrical things. They are discreet things. You learned the importance of patience. You learned that life isn't solved in a day. You learned that God is rarely in a hurry, but he is never late. And all of this qualifies you. It doesn't disqualify you. If you are alive, God is not finished yet. If you are breathing, God still wants to speak to you. If you woke up today, it's because there's something only you can do. Perhaps you are in the most fertile season of your life, not because he has physical strength, but because it has spiritual depth, and I can guarantee you in heaven no one calls you the end. In heaven no one calls you a burden. In heaven no one calls you disposable. In heaven you are called by name and called to purpose. The harvest is not over. The field did not close. Time has not run out. You are alive at the exact right time, at the exact stage, for the exact purpose. And God, who began the good work so many years ago, is still working in you and through you with more intent than ever.